The reason why we're always being recommended to eat fruits and vegetables, because polyphenols have lots of positive effects on our cells, but they don't provide energy to us. So what do? Well, polyphenols act like drugs. They're small molecules that enter the bloodstream. They're a little bit broken up by the bacteria in our stomach, but many of them actually enter intact into the bloodstream, and they get to your cells and they bind to proteins and they bind to the DNA and they modulate the activity of many different cellular processes. They are drugs in actions. And we need them desperately. Without them, we develop lots of diseases and we long-term die.
Welcome to Longevity by Design, a podcast designed to give individuals access to the leading scientific information in the field of longevity. The ability to add years to your life and life to your years needs no opinion. Join us as we ask science to take the wheel. In each episode, Dr. Gil Blander joins a co-host and an industry expert in the field of longevity, shining a light and getting the answers to the key question: how can we live a longer, healthier life?
Hello, I'm Dr. Gil Blander. Welcome to Longevity by Design, how to live a longer, healthier life. We are produced by InstaTracker, your science-based guide to optimize your body from the inside out. Our guest today is Dr. László Barabási, a pioneer in network science and a complex system. He was born in Romania, received his master in theoretical physics in Budapest, and his PhD in physics from Boston University. He is currently served as Distinguished University Professor at Northeastern University, directs the Center of Complex Network Research, and holds an appointment in physics, computer science, and medicine from Harvard Medical School. His fundamental work includes the concept of scale-free network, the Barabási-Hilbert model, and the emergence of network medicine. He is the author of books including Linked, The New Science of Networks, BARS, The Hidden Pattern Behind Everything We Do, and Network Science. Most recently, his research has extended into nutrition and food system, co-coining the idea of nutrition dark matter, of food, and exploring how food networks impact human health and longevity. Welcome, Dr. Barabási.
Thank you, Gil. It's a real pleasure to be talking to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And before we'll dive in, if you are enjoying Longevity by Design, please like and follow the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, so you don't miss any future episode. So I would like to start by talking a bit about your background. And you have been instrumental in creating and popularizing network science. Can you describe your early journey and how you translated from theoretical physics to networks?
Absolutely. And I don't think I translated ever from theoretical physics to networks. I think networks are part of theoretical physics. And in particular, they are part of the field that we call statistical physics or statistical mechanics. And why is that? Because statistical physics deals with randomness. It originally dealt with gases and amorphous materials and so on, but its range has expanded to all complex systems that are affected by random phenomena. All the way from chaos to fractals were all part of statistical physics. And networks are inherently random systems. So no matter whether you think about biological networks or social networks or technological networks, at the first look, they look random. And in many ways, many aspects of their behavior has random components. So if you want to quantify and describe their behavior, their evolution, you do need to use tools from statistical physics. So I focus on networks. I am a network scientist, but I'm also at the same time a theoretical physicist.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I've seen your presentation at ARBD. I think that was last year. And I've seen that more and more physicists are coming into biology. And I think that that's very exciting that more brain power getting into aging and longevity, but also biology in at a whole, because I think that it's a very complex questions and a very complex, as you said, complex interaction in biology, and someone that doesn't understand well physics and chemistry and mathematics and statistics, which will be hard to understand and unpack all the complexity in biology. So it's great to have a bright scientist like you
So,
helping us to understand it.
well, let me put it that way. There are very, very bright scientists in biology and in chemistry as well. So you don't need physicists for that. However, there is a long history of physicists kind of being interested in biological problems. You know, in the Watson and Crick trio, Crick was a physicist. And if you look at the history of molecular biology, I would roughly say that 1/10 of the contributors were actually of physics background. And many, many biology Nobel Prizes has went to people who were actually trained as physicists. And the reason is very simple. Physics offers you a quantitative tool set to deal with empirically observed phenomena. And many ways, many aspects of biological questions require that perspective.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And my follow-up question is, what was the aha moment for you to realize that actually network could explain systems such as web, social interaction, and biology?
That's very interesting. So to kind of find it aha moment, probably I have to go back to when I got interested in the problem. And I was at IBM a postdoc with a fresh PhD. And I said, let me figure out what IBM does. So we're talking about 1994. And, IBM at that time was the archetypical computer company. It was the synonym of the computer. So I went to the library, I remember just before Christmas, and I said, let me get a book on computer science. What kind of animal is that? So I did get several books of computer science. One of them actually said, 50 problems in computer science. And I started to read that over the holidays. And I started to kind of acquaint myself to several issues. And one of the issues that was discussed in that book is effectively computer networks. And the way I read their kind of exposition, I was realizing they're so interesting that we have these networks within the computers, but not only in the computers, right? At that time, I was living in New York City, and I realized there's so many networks that make the city work at that time, right? From the mundane electric network and water pipes, all the way to the social networks and the business networks and so on. And how interesting is that no one is really asking the question how these networks look like. So I would say the first aha moment for me was not as much to recognize, here's a major discovery that I'm making, but rather to see the opportunity that there is here an issue, there is a phenomena that really shapes many of our lives. And yet, when I look into the scientific literature, there was hardly any focus or close to nothing about real networks. And it was there in 1994, I remember in December to January, I decided, okay, I'm going to switch my focus from material science that I was doing at that time, surfaces, to networks.
Yeah, interesting. And definitely, you started working on network in medicine and explore how diseases connect and spread via network. How do concept like resilience and robustness play into this?
Of course. So one of the first questions that comes up is that why does this matter? And I should tell part of the history that even though I decided in 1994 that I will actually focus on networks, the first two papers, one got published, the other never got published. And there was a 5-year period until I could really get hardly anything or actually nothing through the publication pipeline. And it wasn't until 1999 that we had the first breakthrough when we mapped out a portion of the World Wide Web and we discovered this concept of scale-free networks, the one that you mentioned in the introduction. And then soon after that came the next question, why do networks matter? And that's when we first encountered the robustness problem. And robustness is really a fundamental question in many fields. It's an essential in ecology. How do ecological systems stay robust? What do they survive? And when do they not survive? It's a fundamental question in biology, right? So cellular robustness against, we have, as I'm talking to you, we have millions of errors in my cell. Is there a protein not arrived at the same time, or RNA misfolded, or simply wasn't produced, and so on? And yet, I don't know, I can go on and carry on this conversation with you without having to deal consciously with those problems, right? So one of the big questions is that how do cells, how do ecologies, how do even the internet deal with the fact that there are lots of errors within the system? And our first breakthrough came in 2000, actually, soon after our 99 breakthrough, when we kind of started to ask what happens when nodes and links break in the network. And that led to the discovery of what we call today the Achilles heel property of networks. That is, what we showed numerically and through serious examples is that real networks like the cell, like the internet, and so on, are very, very robust to random failures. That is, that when components individually break down, you really have to break down a very, very high fraction, an unrealistically high fraction of the components for you to destroy the connectivity of the network. That is, that the remaining pieces cannot communicate with each other. And that is because of the existence of the scale-free property. And the scale-free property implies the existence of hubs, a couple of very highly connected nodes in the system, a whole hierarchy of highly connected nodes. And when you randomly knock out nodes, you're mostly going to pick the many, many small nodes. And as a result, you're shrinking the system, but you're not destroying it. But we also showed in the same paper that was published, I remember, in the cover of Nature, that there's a price for this robustness, which is the very high sensitivity to attacks. That is, if you know the structure of the network and you focus on the major hubs, then you can very easily and effectively destroy the system. And depending on what system you look at, both the Achilles heel can have advantages and disadvantages, right? It's always an advantage, the robustness feature, right? The fact that these networks are organized in a way that they can survive under a very high level of errors. And the attack intolerance, so the fact that you can destroy the network easily, could be a problem in some cases, like communication systems that you could really attack and be effective at it. But in other cases, could be to our advantage, because we could design drugs that we can destroy the cells we don't want in the cell, right? So that was the first time that we started to kind of think about in my lab about robustness, and that became a very big industry. And it wasn't for another almost 15 years later when the resilience question came along. And it's interesting how I encountered the resilience question. For 3 years, I was heading a working group at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And part of that, I had to show up for the World Economic Forum. And 1 year, the theme of the forum was resilience. And which meant that I listened to lots of talks by experts on resilience. And I realized that these people don't even realize that they talk about networks and they have no idea what a network is. Because we heard talk about ecological resilience, we heard about engineering resilience, political, and so on. But none of the people were actually acknowledging that the systems that they perceive to be resilient is really a network-based system. So what is resilience? In the network language of resilience, it's not only about the structure of the network, how pieces are connected to each other, but it's also about the fact that something is happening on the network. The network has a dynamics, the nodes and the links have their own activity. And the system is resilient when a component breaks down, the system can adjust its dynamics to effectively correct for the error, right? So resilience is a dynamical property of a complex system. Its ability to adjust its behavior to account for errors and failures and so on. And it's a very important property in ecological systems. Like if a rabbit disappears from the ecosystem, then the wolf will learn to eat something else, right? And in the cells as well, if a particular molecule disappears as source, suddenly other biochemical processes will turn on and will bypass the missing pathway or the missing molecule, right? So, and that process required a theory, it required a quantitative perspective. So I believe in 2015, we published a Nature paper where we developed the theory of resilience. And we explicitly showed what is the role of the network and what is the role of the dynamical process that takes place on the network. And so robustness, to summarize, robustness is about the system's architectural integrity. That is, do I still have paths between the nodes? It's something about the architecture of the network. Resilience is dynamical property of the network, its ability to adjust its internal behavior to really correct for any errors or failures that may be taking place, whether those are internal or induced externally.
Yeah, thank you so much for explaining it, and I think that you did a very good job. I can provide an example. I just recently visited in New Zealand. And in New Zealand, as we know, they only had bear that before we arrived to the island, I don't know, in the 16th century. And then we started to bring deers and rabbits and a lot of other. And suddenly, also all the vegetation there is unique to there. And we started to bring trees that are better to build houses. And suddenly, when I visited, it's very hard to see anything that stays from what was before, because everything that we brought from the old world, let's say, actually took over what was in New Zealand. So basically, in your analogy, I assume that the resilience of the New Zealand ecosystem was broken by bringing rabbits and deers and the cows and the sheep and the new vegetation or trees that actually took over of what was there. Is that fair to say?
The way to say it is that it's evidence of the system's resilience that New Zealand ecosystem is still there, despite the introduction of all of these new species, right? So that's what resilience is, right? The ecosystem adjusts to the presence of new species. And then we have seen, with the globalization, we have seen emerging all over the world, either the disappearance of some species, thanks to human activity, as well as the transfer of some species into habitats that were not there before. And the fact that the system survives, and we may be unhappy the way it survived, but it did survive actually, shows that these systems are inherently resilient. And one of the big questions of resilience is that when and how does the system loses its resilience? And that's what precisely we provided the answer, right? We said, listen, we can show mathematically for a system, if you know its dynamics and structure, when is it resilient and how much changes in the topology you have to do. That is, how much destruction will the system be able to suffer before it loses its resilience. Yeah. And let's talk about the key feature about the resilience that going to become probably important for the later discussion if we start talking about aging, is that what is a key feature of resilience? Resilience's key feature is that system has a fixed point, meaning that when you disturb a system, it will always return in the vicinity of that particular fixed point. But that is not guaranteed. When you start changing the network, when you start removing nodes and links from the system, you change the weights in the links, then suddenly, or not suddenly, but at a certain moment, another fixed point could emerge, which could be that, or could be the lack of an ecosystem. And once that has emerged, a big enough fluctuation, a big enough perturbation in the system could kick you over the barrier and put you into that state. So let me give you one example to bring this home. In South America, I was 2 years ago with my son to the Amazon forest, and it's remarkable, both its scale and to some degree its resilience despite of the many human actions, right? We're cutting out trees, we're destroying the environment, and the system is still so far surviving. What is the danger with the Amazon forest? If you look around the earth in the same latitude, there's always steppe. So it's grass and not an Amazon forest. So in the moment you destroy too much of this, one day to the other, the whole forest will disappear and will become grass. And there's no way back to it, right? So that's the moment when enough destruction has destroyed the network enough such that the other fixed point becomes relevant. And once you reach the other fixed point, you cannot revive the system. You cannot rebuild actually the Amazon forest.
Yeah, and that's a great example. So if we are taking it to aging, what you are saying, we are actually jumping from a specific set point to another, and they are always in the aging process. Each set point is worse than the set point before, and it's very hard to go back, correct? And our goal is to try to stay in the former set point as much as possible. Is it fair to say?
Very interesting. And I'm glad you asked. And actually, I have a really cool project with one of my Israeli postdocs at Banaya where we are now applying the tool set of resilience to aging. And our hypothesis is that aging is really a loss of resilience. And there's lots of evidence for that from the literature. Frailty is a signal of the loss of resilience. The emergence of inflammation, your ability to recover actually from injury is all kind of typical signatures of loss of resilience. When we apply, what's interesting about humans is that they are never resilient. We humans are never resilient because that is always an option. Right? So we don't have that fixed point to say, no matter what I do to a human, it will always stay alive, come back to a life state. So we humans always have the alive and the not alive fixed point. And the question is, what is the barrier between them? And how close you are at that critical point, then the only option is death, right? Mm. And we are able to show that if we apply to the submolecular networks, the regulatory networks between the cell, the resilience framework, we can predict analytically many of the features that the aging community has been documenting as the signatures of aging and the evolution of the aging. And they seem to be very much lining up with the theoretical framework that we have developed 10 years ago about how a system approaches that point when not only resilience, but also the healthy fixed point is being lost. And then the only option is really death in this case.
So in your model, you have a yes, no, you are resilient or not, and you're resilient meaning you are alive, and you're not resilient, you are dead. That's the way?
No, we have alive and death. So in humans, we don't have the pure resilient point. The resilient point would be the one that no matter how much you perturb the human will always stay alive. That you won't get, right?
Yeah.
But we do have the two coexistence of the two fixed point, right? The one when you're alive and the one you are no longer alive, and the gap between them is very large. And what you can show in these equations that as you age, which in this case you get mutations and epimutations, the two of them approach, and eventually the distance becomes smaller and smaller, which means that now when I'm far away, a small perturbation will always take me back to the healthy state, right? If I get flu, I'll survive. If I get COVID, I survive. I may get even cancer and I survive, right? But when the barrier between them is tiny, then that fluctuation that I easily survived earlier, now it's death for me.
Yeah.
And so once I get over that barrier, then the next point available to me is not to be alive, or for the cell in this case not to be alive, and the cell will die. And if, of course, enough cells die, then we don't survive ourselves.
Yeah.
So we actually think that the resilience framework is a very fruitful way to kind of think about it. It's not an easy framework for the aging community because it's a highly mathematical framework, and to be very honest, that's not the language the aging community is using, right? Yeah. But we find it very promising, and we're very excited about it.
Yeah, and again, to see my perspective, I'm hearing more and more about it. So it's very exciting again to hear people like you and other physicists or mathematicians that coming with this model. So let me try to break it down for our audience to be sure that I understood it, but also to try to simplify it for them. So what you are saying that you have two states, alive and death. But when you are younger, the life and the death is very far away. And when you are getting older, it's getting closer and closer and closer. And even a small perturbation, as you said, maybe a virus infect your body, can kill you. While when you are young, the distance is so big, so you will go down a bit, but you will jump back to, let's say, to the resilience. And
Absolutely. And I would add a mountain between the two of them. So there's a mountain between them. And when you are far away, the mountain is very hard. So you have to climb up the mountain to die, right? So the
yeah.
perturbation, but when the two are close to them, the mountain becomes much smaller as well. It becomes a hill and it's easy to jump over.
Yeah, and I'm just trying to simplify it even more. So the changes, I would say, it could be, for example, DNA mutation. So you
Yeah.
have more and more mutation where you're getting older.
So
That's correct, or
it's the mutations, the one that brings these closer, right? That you accumulate during lifetime. And that's very well documented. We accumulate both DNA mutations as well as we accumulate epi mutations. And that's the one that narrows the gap between them. And the fluctuations are typically much more drastic external fluctuations, like breaking a bone, getting a major disease, which if you are young, you survive. Right. Because a disease means that it perturbs your state, right? All of your physiological measurements are changing, right? And the question is that if you're young, that still keeps you in that fixed point, because in order to kill you, you have to climb a big mountain. When you age, actually, that mountain is very small. So the same perturbation that you easily laugh down as a young person now could be lethal for you. And we see it over and over, right? When we had COVID was a wonderful example. Young people didn't have to worry about COVID, right? Elderly people have to worry about COVID, right? But it's not only COVID. Any type of influenza poses the same type of problem. A kid doesn't worry about influenza. We don't worry about the kid influenza. When an 80-year-old person gets influenza, you're worried.
yeah. And again, if I'm trying to simplify it more, and sorry that I'm double clicking it all the time, but I think that it's a fascinating theory. So actually, the disease is a side effect of the aging process. So the disease is not because in a way it's an effect of the mutation and the epigenetic mutation. Do you agree to that?
So that's a very different story, and I'm happy to have that conversation. First of all, the disease could be externally induced, like a bacterial infection or a viral infection. But also, when we are born with certain genetic defects, which is one way to say that all the diseases that I will die from were already growing in my body. I don't have any symptoms, right? But those genetic defects that we are born are slowly being amplified through my system. That has nothing to do with aging, right? And aging is a different process. Aging is the accumulation of new mutations during life, right? So these are what we call somatic mutations, or the accumulation of epigenetic changes through life. So when you ask whether that particular perturbation could be aging induced or not, the way I think about it is not necessarily, right? What is aging induced is our inability to respond to perturbations, right? The system lost its ability to be resilient, and hence cannot fight off easily, cannot adjust. The cells cannot adjust their behavior so easily as when they were young to respond to perturbation happens. The perturbation could come externally, but could be simply something that is developing over 50 years in your body, and it's an internal perturbation thanks to a mutation that you inherited from your parents.
Yeah, and to continue on that, so aging is one, I would say, axis. Another axis can be the BMI or the weight. When you have a higher BMI, you also, in a way, your resilience getting lower. That's correct?
Absolutely. But you could also think of BMI and the other kind of lifestyle issues that affect aging as you're just accelerating your aging clock.
Okay.
Right? So you're further down the line, smaller the gap, right? But you could also think of it as, yes, indeed, it is one of those things that can lower the border between the boundary being alive and not being alive at the cellular level.
Okay, so in your view, someone in the age of 25 that his BMI is, let's say, 20 versus someone at the age of 25 that his BMI is 40, someone with the BMI 40 is more like a 40 years old than 25 years old.
This is not my view, right? The clocks are showing that. So the clocks are showing that lifestyle changes or lifestyle choices affect our effective aging, right? The biological age. And so when I say that, I'm just really looking at the evidence that has really emerged thanks to the discovery of the Horvath clock, right? That has kind of become part of our thinking that yeah, our biological age is not the same and as our kind of calendar age, and that affects pretty much our health.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense to me.
As a Longevity by Design podcast listener, you understand the value of improving your health for today and for all the years ahead. And if you want to live your healthiest, longest life possible, you need to understand what's going on inside. At Inside Tracker, we take a personalized approach to health span optimization that eliminates guesswork from your wellness plan. Inside Tracker analyzes blood biomarker and DNA data, along with physiomarker data from fitness trackers like Oura Ring, to deliver personalized food, supplement, lifestyle, and exercise recommendations that allow you to take control and improve your health span. And for a limited time, Longevity by Design listeners can get 20% off at the Inside Tracker store. So if you're ready to receive a personal health analysis and data-driven wellness plan to optimize your body for the long haul, then it's time to start inside. Visit insidetracker.com/podcast to get started today. That's insidetracker.com/podcast to get started today.
And you mentioned the biological clock. So what do you think about epigenetic reprogramming? That really can take us back to more resilience, or you don't know yet?
That's the promise. And we actually explore that, and we think that that's one way. I mean, so let's kind of step back and say, where does aging come from, at least based on our current understanding, right? And it's increasingly we see aging as an accumulation of damage. And there are two very different damages that are coming from the same source. The source is DNA breaks, right? That DNA is broken over and over thanks to the internal processes that relate to copying, as well as external processes like radiation, smoking, and other things, right? And in most of the cases, a broken DNA is repaired without damage, but in few cases, it leaves behind mutations and epimutations. Because when you have to fix the DNA, a broken DNA, that's a very costly and very damaging process locally. And you're not perfect, so that means that you may induce a mutation, or some cases you just may induce the envelope of the DNA, meaning that the epigenetic access, right, may induce changes in that. So at least the current thinking is that the accumulation of these mutations, epi and really DNA mutations, cause actually aging. And that is more or less an unavoidable process, right? And we tend to think that's lifestyle choices. One of the reasons we have so much difficulty of kind of inducing changes in aging is because if really this accumulation matters, this is intrinsic to the cell's ability to fix itself, right? So it's not as much lifetime induced, but it is really intrinsic. It's driven by intrinsic processes. We can do something about to slow it down, but not to eliminate it, right? And then so to what degree it is mutations or epimutations, it's a big question. But in the last 5-10 years, indeed, the community has switched to think that it's the epigenetic changes are more important than the mutation-based changes. And a few beautiful experiments that had managed to show evidence of rejuvenation by epigenetic reprogramming are strongly supporting that view, right? So we don't really have an objective way to think how much of the aging is due to genetic mutations as how much is to epigenetic mutations, but it's very, very encouraging the fact that epigenetic reprogramming seems to induce symptoms that seem to be related to effective rejuvenation. So it's not one or the other, they're both there, and the evidence is shifting a little bit towards the role of the epigenetics, which if it's true, then epigenetic rejuvenation may be a cure down the line.
Yeah. So you believe that it might be a full cure, or it will be, again, I'm trying to understand, can we live to 5,000, or can we live to 200, and can we live to 150, or you don't know yet?
I don't know. I'm hopeful. And I think we are
Yes.
all, well, I don't think anybody has an answer. If they say so, I would like to see their evidence. I think we're all hopeful that this will lead to an extension of the human lifetime, or at least the active lifetime, right? And that's what we call longevity, and that's what your
Yeah.
podcast is about. So we don't have to
Yes.
explain that one any longer to your
Yeah.
audience. And if
Yes.
we achieve that, that's beautiful. Are we going to achieve 5,000 years or 200 years lifetime? I have absolutely no idea how to think about that problem.
Yeah, no, me too. But I agree with you that it's very encouraging to see that at least in some model organism, we could see extension by epigenetic rejuvenation. So at least there, we can see already the data. Great discussion about aging. And aging is one of my favorite subjects, but also nutrition is one of my favorite subjects. And I know that is also one of your favorite subjects. And you influence and worked on and still working on a very fascinating part of that. And that's what you call the nutritional dark matter. And that's basically, if you look today at the USDA database, there are around 150 ingredients that build each food item. And what you are showing is that there are not 150, there are thousands, and maybe the one that are a bit, let's say they are micronutrient, they are not the majority or the major part of the food, but they can be maybe a very important part of it. So can you explain that to the audience? How did you came to that? And what have you seen so far related to the dark nutrition dark matter?
Sure. So let me maybe step back and say, why did we become interested in this problem, right? And so one of the area that my lab is very active is what we call network medicine. The network medicine is really acknowledges the fact that the components of the cell are not isolated, but life is really about the interactions between the components. And so just giving you the list of genes doesn't give you life, right? It's really the interactions between the proteins and the molecules that eventually leads to life. And network medicine is something that I started to develop in the lab, in my lab, in the kind of like in around 2005 or so. And now it's a big discipline, and there are many, many people involved in that. And what it does is it tries to map out the networks within the cell. And we developed a series of tools through which you can actually identify new drug targets, new potential interventions, and so on. And some of these have already reached the market, and patients are benefiting from it. So that's really my basic tool set when it comes to biology. But about 10 years ago, we started to think about it. Well, listen, network medicine is ultimately still based in genetics, right? Because the components of the cells are provided by the genome. And what we are adding here is who is interacting with whom, which is also genetically encoded of how a protein can bind to another protein. But we know that genomics alone can only explain a very small percentage of disease causation, right? 10 to 20% of the diseases that we have in the population can be attributed to mutations or genomic background. And then you always ask, where is the rest? Right. And then the rest, we always say it's environmental effects. And well, what are the environmental effects? Well, it's exercise, it's stress, it's lots of things. But the biggest gorilla in the room is always food. Why food? Because on a daily basis, I push down thousands of molecules through my throat that end up in my cells. And they somehow modulate the activity of each of my cells. And so I said, okay, let's go ahead and build that knowledge, the food, into this network medicine picture. So let's see who are these molecules and how they are affecting the network, the interactions between the components, because that's the only way you can actually influence the cell or our health, right? You have to somehow do something at the cellular level. So we said, let's find out who are these molecules. And I said, that's probably easy. Somebody will have a database. And I was very shocked to learn that, no, we don't have that database. And then you would say, well, how about nutrition? And you kind of pointed to that, right? Yes, nutrition is a very well-established field that has been looking at the molecules that are in the food. But when you look carefully, they only care about one class of molecules, which are the energy sources. Nutrition is really about cataloging the chemicals that we need to survive on a daily basis. And what we need to survive are mainly energy sources, right? And amino acids. And because those are the building blocks of our proteins. And we need vitamins, right? Because the vitamins is just another way to say a small group of chemicals without which the machinery doesn't work. These are the oils in the system, like vitamin C and little iron and little thing. They're not a lot, but just enough we need for the system to work. But then when you actually look at what's in the food, you realize that it's not only these 150 molecules that we call vitamins, but first, when we started to look at it, we realized there were 20,000 molecules that were documented to be in the food. What does it mean to be documented? That people have done mass spec on that and chemical studies, and they said this molecule is in tomato, this molecule is in potato, this one is in meat, that are not nutritional components. So we started a process to say, how do we collect what's in the food? And that process, the nutritional dark matter database that we curate in my lab, now has 135,000 molecules. And now you would say, what are these? What do they do to us? And previously, it's not that nutrition people did not know that food would have other molecules, but the general belief was that they don't matter, right? That they're inert. They go in and out because they're not energy components. So we don't know, but the metabolism doesn't really see them. But we increasingly realize that is not the case. And let me tell you a story about one particular class of molecules that we all know that are important, which are the polyphenols. Polyphenols are something that we only get through plants, vegetables, fruits, because they are produced by the secondary metabolism of these plants. What is a secondary metabolism? Well, there's a major difference between plants and animals, which really determines their chemistry, which is the fact that plants cannot run, which is the way we defend ourselves, and all mammals defend themselves is by physical activity, by muscles. Plants cannot run. Their defense is chemical, which means it's through their look, to their structure, to their state, to their integrity, chemical structure, integrity, and so on. So the plants had to develop a massive, what we call secondary metabolism, which you could think of it as a massive chemical factory that we don't have, and no mammalians have, to produce the many, many molecules that provide their color, their taste, their structural components, their hardness, and so on, because that's what they need for survival. And it happens that we need those chemicals. And one big chemicals that we desperately need from plants are polyphenols. And that's the reason why we're always being recommended to eat fruits and vegetables, because polyphenols have lots of positive effects on our cells. But they don't provide energy to us. So what do they do? Well, polyphenols act like drugs. They're small molecules that enter the bloodstream. They're a little bit broken up by the bacteria in our stomach, but many of them actually enter intact into the bloodstream, and they get to your cells and they bind to proteins and they bind to the DNA and they modulate the activity of many, many different cellular processes. They are drugs in actions, right? And we need them desperately. Without them, we develop lots of diseases and we long-term die, right? And so this is what these 150,000 molecules do. They're not energy sources, but they're essential for the health of the cell. They're modulating many, many different activities in the cell. And so that's how we kind of ended up now developing this whole, what we call Foodome project, which is actually the jacket that I'm wearing here, right? Is that the Foodome project on one end has one giant dream in it, which is let's map out what's in the food. And I find it mind-boggling, the fact that we don't know that for sure, right? We don't know what's in your food. And this is not to say that we don't know. We have 135,000 molecules that we catalog in our lab, right? But those 135,000, we really don't know what foods they are. One kind of chemical was seen in tomato. The other one was seen in another plant. And we don't know whether it's present in other plants or not. If you take any food item, you don't get a complete list of the chemicals within that.
Yeah.
And given the fact that such a high fraction of diseases are caused by that, by the eating pattern, I find it mind-boggling that we're not even investing into mapping that out. We need a human genome project for the food. We did a food genome project, right? And this is not to actually map out the genome, because we do have the genome of many of these food items, but to map out the chemicals that are in there that we end up being consuming. So that's one of the big journey in my lab, is to develop the tools and the technologies and the concepts of how do you map these things out? And we do mass spec. We work with mass spectrometers. We developed AI-based tools and many other things. And we catalog data in the literature to create this very, very detailed picture of what are the chemicals in the food, which in the long run, it will be indispensable and I believe transformative for the way we think about health.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And I remember when I started InstaTracker, I said, okay, let's look at, for example, at nuts and see what is different between walnut, tree nut, and any other nut. And it's very hard to do it when you only have, as you said, like 150 ingredient. But when you will have the tens of thousands of them, suddenly you will know this one have this polyphenol when the other one have that. And then maybe tree nuts is good for me and walnuts is good for you. But right now, when we have only, let's say, 150 Lego block instead out of the 20,000 Lego block, we are still blind, and it's very hard for us to understand why this food is good for you and not good for me.
And I'm glad you raised that question, because the first question really, which I'm really puzzled that we are not doing it as humanity, is to find out what are the chemicals there, all right? And I think there's a path towards, but we just need a bigger investment into that problem to do that. But the second question, what do these chemicals do one by one? Because let's do that. I do give you the full list of walnut and some other nuts, right? Why does it different matters? And that's the second journey we do in my lab. We developed a whole set of tools based on network medicine to identify once that molecule gets into your bloodstream, what proteins can it bind to? And then what is its potential health effect? And so the tools of network medicine are ideal for that. And that's what I would call the second moonshot. The first would be to map out the chemicals in the food, which would require probably hundreds of millions of dollars investment to do it right, but it's possible to do. But the second one is, once you have that list, and we already have a good enough list for each of them to identify what are its potential health effects. And these are two different moonshots that we sooner or later have to invest into as humanity.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that one good outcome from that is we can find a lot of drug candidate that we can then purify and use it as a pill and then have a more variety of drug. All of us know that right now the pipeline started to dry because from all the chemical experiment, that's where we are. But actually, usually what nature make, there is a reason that nature make it. So there is a better chance that it will work.
I'm glad you raised that, because actually, when you look at the current drug pool that we have, which is about 6,000 to 7,000 drugs that are kind of in human use right now, about 1/3 of them are food molecules, like vitamin C, right?
Yes.
Because the early discovery phase for finding actually therapeutic agents was really to find things that were already in the food. But there are many. And the other third, I would guesstimate, would be food molecules that have been chemically modified or atomic level modified to make them stronger binders. But I'm totally there with you. I think that we have here in my lab 135,000 molecules, and probably there are many more, right, that have some interesting features. First of all, they are safe for us to consume because they're already in the food, right?
Yes.
Second, many of them have already co-evolved with us. We co-evolved with them. So they have some kind of health impact. They modulate the activity of the cell. And so they could really be potential drugs. And once we identify them, we're not only finding a molecule that works, but we're also finding a mechanism of action, right? And then once we have that mechanism of action, we can modify these molecules and make them more potent binders, for example, to increase their efficiency. and can be turned into something that we really kind of see as a drug as well. So I think food is a gold mine for us to really start looking at kind of developing new drugs and new therapies for humans.
Yeah, and if anyone from that working on policy or a policymaker or anyone from the pharmaceutical industry that listen to us, yeah, maybe you should change your mind and start looking into that and maybe working with Laszlo on this project, which in my opinion is really exciting. Another thing that your work found is what is the reason that ultra processed food are not good for us? So can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. So we talked about what's in the food, what are the chemicals in the food, and of course, what are their individual effect, but we haven't talked about how much, right?
Yeah.
How these chemicals are in the food. So when we actually started to explore how much of each of these polyphenols or even each of the nutritional components that are brand cataloged, we realized that first of all, when it comes to the quantities of the different chemicals, there are about 9 orders of magnitude variations. What do I mean by that? Vitamin K typically comes like 10 to the minus 6 grams per 100 gram food, right? Water is about 70 grams per 100 gram food. So that is already an 8 order of magnitude difference. And when you look at all the nutritional components, there are orders of magnitude difference of how much you find in your food. But what is very interesting is that when you look at all the different plants that have vitamin K or all the different, any type of food, how much they have is very narrowly defined. It's all in the vicinity of minus 10 to the minus 6 grams. You will not find any food that would give you 2 grams of vitamin K, right? And one of the reasons, and we kind of published that in Nature Food, is that because at the end, how much of any chemical being produced by a plant or by an animal is really determined by the metabolic network of that organism. And that has highways and has small roads. And if the chemical is produced by a small road, it will never be a lot because it's a small road, right? And if it's a highway like ATP, then it's going to be a lot of it because we need a lot of it, and it's really exists on this very high production rate. So what's interesting, however, is that the chemical concentrations are fixed across plants, and they vary very little from one plant to the other one. And I believe that we have co-evolved to process this, right? That is to kind of have that concentrations coming naturally for us. Now, what happens with our food production? Well, we have learned to chemically alter our food. Typically, chemically altering means that processing food implies that we are increasing the energy density and we are shifting the chemical concentration of the food. We have much more sugar than we normally have, right? We have many more calories than we had before. And we can talk about why and where this came from. It's all started here in my neighborhood outside of Boston, right? But fundamentally, processing means that we are chemically altering the concentration of the chemicals in the food. Now, why is it a problem? Because if I'm going to give you 10 hydrogens and 1 oxygen and I say, go ahead and make me lots of water, you would say, well, I can make only 1 water molecule, right? Because I have only 1 oxygen. And what's going to happen with the rest of the hydrogen? It's going to have to develop somewhere. So this is what, in my view, what happens when we eat ultra-processed food. When the chemical composition does not match with the chemical composition that we were evolutionarily developed with, then some chemicals have to deposit, right? So ultra processing is, let's talk about what is ultra processing. So there is natural food, an apple, right? A vegetable, which you didn't touch. There is processing, which is anything that you can do in your kitchen typically. Cutting, freezing, warming, cooking, and things like that. Ultra processing is you need a factory for, which is kind of chemically processing, really extracting certain chemicals, infusing other chemicals in there for the purpose of making it, giving it longer shelf time, which reduces the price, right? And increasing the energy density, right? So these are, and of course, palatability and the taste and so on. So there's lots of reasons why we ultra processed food. And in that process, we shift the chemical profile of these. And what happens with those unbalanced processes? Well, as I said, we have highways and we have small roads in our cells. And we can only consume things at those ratios. And we get it in the wrong ratio, things get developed. Fundamentally, we have been in the last few years doing lots of work on ultra processed food. One is to understand the fundamentals of how they are different. And second is, how do we tell when something is ultra processed? Because there's no label anywhere on the box to say this is ultra processed and this is purely processed. And so we developed actually an AI tool that looks at the what legally you must actually share, which is typically the nutritional components. By law you have to share. And from that, it detects the chemical variations when there are deviations from the normal, and will tell you how ultra processed it is. And we did it as a research project because we were curious about it, but then we ended up running this one through the not only through a massive food database, which more than 50,000 fruits in the US market, but we also developed it to kind of run through Whole Foods and Target and Walmart databases. And after we published it also in Nature Food, the data itself, we ended up putting out a website, which is truefood.tech, that we allow any people to look up if they go to Whole Foods, how ultra processed is what they want to buy. And we thought this is the research database. We were super shocked and continue to be shocked when we see 1 to 3 million people a day coming to that database and checking out and making decisions of what to buy in Whole Foods or in Walmart. So what we are realizing is that we really tapped into a knowledge base that people seek, but they don't have access to. And there's increasing awareness of how ultra-processed food is bad for us. We know a 10% increase in ultra-processed food consumption increases with about 5 to 10% your cancer rate, diabetes rate, even neurodegenerative diseases, and so on. And we don't provide the resources to individuals to really acknowledge, to really distinguish ultra-processed food from non-ultra-processed food. And the truefood.tech database that we put out apparently is a first step in that direction.
Yeah, very interesting. And do you know why the ultra-processed food increased the cancer rate and or other bad effect, or we don't know yet?
We don't know that, and I think it would be a long journey for us. And with all honesty, the reason why ultra-processed food became such a central issue is thanks to a Brazilian group who about 15 years ago started to kind of distinguish, also like manually classify foods that are ultra-processed from non-ultra-processed food based on the production method. And they provided first awareness of ultra-processing, so then other people can now use that data to do epidemiological studies and show these results that I mentioned to you, that if you increase your ultra-processed food consumption, then all the chances for diseases goes up, number one. And then it also provided us the training data based on which we could now develop this AI tool to really recognize because they only have that database for a few thousand foods. And with the AI tool, we're now able to generalize to any kind of food. So we can tell about any food how ultra-processed it. And let me just be very clear. There are lots of foods that we naturally think good for us are inherently ultra-processed, like yogurts, right? Because that's a fermentation process. So the question is not necessarily whether ultra-processed is good for you or not, right? Some are good. The question is, what is more ultra-processed within the same category? So you should not kind of compare yogurts with meats, right? And meats with cookies, because those are in different categories. And for that reason, for example, in truefood.tech, we don't necessarily provide the actual ultra-processing score, because by itself, that is not meaningful. What is meaningful that within your category, are you more or less ultra-processed than other products within that category? Yeah. And because when it comes to fermented food, our algorithm always tells you that there is some degree of processing happening on them, because you're fermenting it, right? But manipulating more or less? Are you closer to natural or very, very deviant?
Let's look at fish, for example. So you have, let's say, sushi versus a fish that you put on the pan versus a fish burger. So basically what you are saying, sushi is better than fish on the pan, and fish on the pan is better than a fish burger, correct?
No, I'm saying they're all equally good for you, right? Because those are all processing that you can do of your own. So there's no problem whatsoever with processed food. Remember, we define processing as something that you can do within your kitchen, right?
Okay.
You can do the sushi in your kitchen, because what is sushi? It's raw fish that is being sliced into very thin slices and added to rice and vegetables, right?
Yeah.
So, or just raw fish by itself, right? And
Yeah.
that itself is not processing. That itself is processing, but not ultra processing.
Yeah.
Ultra processing is something that you can do in factories only. Let me give an example. When you buy orange juice in the supermarket, it may have big letters on it in orange saying organic, but it's typically ultra processed. Why is that? Because orange is being connected across different markets at different level of ripening and different sugar contents. So what happens with the euro is that it's immediately squeezed out locally, and then it's chemically split into the gulp, into the acids, and into the just pure water, right? And then it's being transported as 3 different ingredients to the local market where you need orange juice, and then being remixed. But when you do that remixing, you don't any have the taste and the look of an orange juice. So you start adding sugar, you start adding color, and you start adding other chemicals to kind of recreate the feeling of the orange juice, even though you have the basic elements, right?
Yeah.
And so that makes orange juice, what you buy in the supermarket, ultra processed food. What you squeeze at home is just processed. There is absolutely no problem, at least we don't see any evidence whatsoever health-wise of processed food having adversary health effects. It is ultra processing, the chemical separation and the recombination, the addition of the many new molecules and so on, that seems to be largely responsible for the effect based on our current knowledge. And I want to emphasize, our understanding of ultra-processed food and its health effects is very new. I would say the last 5 years, right? So it's a very moving subject. And in particular, we typically do not understand the mechanisms of action. But the epidemiological evidence is increasingly clear that they have negative health effects.
Okay, so I'm happy that I asked this question because it's not easy to distinguish between ultra-processed and not ultra-processed, and using your website can help basically the shopper to understand exactly what is and what is not. That's fair to say?
That's exactly right, yes.
Okay. Excellent. So I was planning to ask many more questions, but we are already in the 1 hour mark. So I would like to move to a section that basically I'm asking a quick question, and they would like to receive from you, if possible, a quick answer as much as possible. And the first one is about one network concept you use every day in your own life.
Hubs. This is the big discovery we made in 99, that most networks develop naturally hubs, very highly connected web pages, people with lots of connections and so on. And one thing we learn is that once they are present, they fundamentally determine the system's ability to get things done. In social networks, it's the hubs that rotate the earth, right? Those are the things that make things happen. You want to be friends with hubs and so on. So I always look out to identify in the particular system what I care about, whether that's art, whether that's food, whether it's science, who are the hubs and how can I engage with them?
Interesting, very interesting answer. And the question about food. A food or dietary habit that you should reflect a strong nutrient network.
Plants and vegetables, right? We've been told over and over that we have to eat lots of plants and vegetables, and most people think that that's because how we lose weight. No, it has nothing to do with that, right? It has to do with the fact that plants and vegetables have lots of chemicals that we can only get from them, and our cells desperately need them to function. And they help us kind of clean many free radicals from the cells, and they modulate on a daily basis the cellular activity. For that reason, now my diet is always one dish a day is always a salad to get my load and also of kind of vegetables and fruits.
Okay, that's a good one. One behavior or habit you believe is underappreciated for longevity?
Walking. Well, right now, the single intervention that we have for increasing longevity is really exercise. We have nothing comparable to that. And within that, walking is very underappreciated because more and more we see that very excessive sports are not really a tool for longevity. To the contrary, they shorten life, right? But walking is one of those kind of exercises that give you low intensity, durable exercise that seems to be most correlated with longevity. And I wish more people with their busy lifestyle, they can set their life in the way to actually walk a lot. For that reason, I'm actually living 1 hour away from my workplace and I walk there and I walk back every day.
Really cool. And a few episodes ago, I interviewed a scientist that basically look at our sedentary life, because now most of us sitting next to the table and next to the computer for, let's say, 9 to 5. And what he recommended is even break that and every 50 minutes go for a walk for 10 minutes and then come again, because we haven't been designed to sit all the day. We were designed to move. And
I have one rule. Every single Zoom meeting, I take walking. Of course, this one we had to record, so I couldn't. But if you want to have a half an hour conversation with me, it will be during my walk to the office or back.
Excellent. Yeah. So thank you for that. And the last question is, what do you do to recharge or reset your network resilience?
That's a good question. All of the above, vegetables and walking, but you also have to have a passion. And of course, I have the passion for science and discovery, but I also have a deep passion for art. So, for example, every month I disappear for 6 weeks from my lab and I go to Budapest and I work in an art studio and not touch science. And then trust me, at the end of the summer, I am so eager to come back to solve the problem of aging.
Yeah, no, I agree. I know that for me is that I'm not taking 6 weeks, but I'm going when I'm going cycling outside and cleaning my brain for an hour or two. I'm coming back, and my brain is so fresh that I can really focus. But when you sit all the day, your brain started to be cluttered with all the information. So I think that that's a great suggestion. And the last question that I have for you is, if our listener remember just one idea from your work, what should it be?
Connectedness. Nothing happens in isolation. We live in networks. Our biological existence is driven by the networks between ourselves. Social economic existence is driven by the networks we are part of. We tend to think about people, molecules, instead of thinking about relationships. But really, the success of life and health is all about relationships. So think network.
Yeah, and your point about the hub is a very interesting one. Always try to find the hub and always try to strive to be a friend with the hub, because if you'll be a friend with the hub, you'll become the hub later on. So strive to the moon and you'll be in the moon. So I really like that. And thank you so much for joining us and sharing how Eden Network, from our cells to our food, shape our health and longevity. For listeners who want to learn more, explore his work at barabasilab.com and follow his research at Northeastern University. And for the audience, if you enjoyed today's episode of Longevity by Design, please like and follow the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Leave a rating and review. It's help others to discover this conversation about science, health, and longevity. Thank you again for tuning into Longevity by Design, produced by Inside Tracker. We'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Longevity by Design. Please subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. Longevity by Design is powered by Inside Tracker, a personalized health optimization platform that helps people improve their lives by improving their bodies from the inside out, using personalized, science-backed recommendations for nutrition, supplements, and lifestyle changes. To learn more, visit insidetracker.com/podcast.